Welcome back to Remnants of the Veil, Episode 4, The Roots. Prologue. The argument started, as most arguments in Sector Aura 7 did, with Warlord Thorruk losing his patience. This is Warlord Thorruk on open broadcast. The structure is approaching. The diameter of the gate itself. It is still growing. It has been growing for 9 days, and it shows no sign of stopping. It is between us and the gate. It is broadcasting vibrations that are affecting crew performance across every fleet in this sector. My engineers cannot sleep. My soldiers are on edge. My sensor equipment has been useless since the day this thing arrived. He paused. I am done watching. We go inside. The response was not immediate. On 300 ships, officers exchanged glances and waited for someone else to speak first. Captain Vasquez broke the silence. Defiance copies. I've been recommending this for a week, Warlord. What changed your mind? 9 days of doing nothing, Captain. My overlord sent me here to find answers. I have found nothing but questions in a tree that won't stop growing. That changes today. Before we agree to walk into an alien organism, the size of a continent, Vasquez said carefully, I need to raise some tactical concerns. We don't know what the atmosphere inside is like. We don't know if our communications will work through that much biomass. We don't know if we can find our way back out. And we don't know if the entity will let us leave. Those are reasons to bring weapons, Captain, not reasons to stay outside. Those are reasons to plan, Warlord. There's a difference. We have been planning for 9 days. Planning has produced nothing. A new voice entered the channel. Not from the Velithari, who still refused to broadcast on open frequencies, but from the vault of whispered ledgers. Merchant Prince Yaveth, wearing a human voice that was pleasant and precise and belonged to no one in particular. If I may interject, the Syndicate has been monitoring the entity's growth patterns. The expansion rate has not decreased, but the growth pattern has changed. 9 days ago, it was expanding outward, extending roots, claiming space. In the last 3 days, the growth has shifted inward. Mass and energy are concentrating at its center. Our sensors cannot penetrate deep enough to determine why. A pause. Whatever the entity is doing, it is approaching a conclusion. The question is not whether someone goes inside. The question is whether you go now while it is still building or later when it is finished. And what is the Syndicate's recommendation? Vasquez asked. The Syndicate does not make recommendations. The Syndicate provides information. What you do with it is your concern. Another pause. However, I will note that the Syndicate will not be sending a delegation. The risk-to-intelligence ratio is unfavorable. Translated from Thyrasil, Thorruk said. That means they're afraid. Translated from Drakor, Yaveth replied smoothly. That means you're about to do something reckless, and we would prefer to watch. The channel went quiet for a moment. Then Vasquez spoke again. Yaveth raises a fair point about the internal changes. My science team has been tracking the same thing. The entity is concentrating energy at its center. Something is building in there. If we're going to make contact, doing it while whatever is happening is still in progress might give us more information than waiting until it's finished. Or it might mean we're walking into something that isn't ready for visitors, said a voice Vasquez didn't recognize, one of the freeborn captains listening on the open channel. Has anyone considered that this thing might not want us inside it? It opened a corridor the size of a hyperlane when the Drakor fired at it, Vasquez said. It didn't close it. If it didn't want visitors, it would have sealed itself. Or, it's a trap. Everything in this sector might be a trap. The gate might be a trap. The signal might be a trap. At some point, we have to stop being afraid of traps and start walking through doors. From the Luminarch Etherius, silence. The Velithari never responded on open channels. But 40 seconds later, a Whisper-class scout materialized beside the Defiance and transmitted high Resonant Syvelith's reply in a frequency every ship could receive. The entity is not a trap. I have been feeling its vibrations for 9 days. There is no hostility in them. There is no deception. There is need. It needs to communicate. It has been trying since the day it arrived, and it has not yet found a way to reach us from the outside. We must go to it. She paused. The silence on the channel was absolute. I will bring a scholar, Aelendra, a student of the deep current. Her expertise will be necessary for interpreting what we find inside. I will also bring guards because the Warlord is correct about one thing: preparation is not weakness. A scholar, Thorruk said. I'm bringing soldiers. Bring what makes you comfortable, Warlord. Soldiers always make me comfortable. I know. That is precisely why you need a scholar. Vasquez cut in before the exchange escalated. Here's what I propose. 3 delegations, armed escort, reasonable, not excessive, scientific equipment. We enter together, we stay together, and we establish a communication relay at the entry point so our ships can reach us. If anything goes wrong, we fall back to the shuttles and extract. Standard first contact protocols. The Terran Remnant has first contact protocols? Thorruk asked. We do now. I wrote them this morning. Vasquez paused. Do we have agreement? 3 delegations, 1 hour. We go in and we find out what this thing wants. Agreed, Thorruk said. The Velithari courier transmitted one word. Agreed. Yaveth's voice returned one final time. The Syndicate will monitor from the vault. We wish you fortune. And we will want a full debrief when you return, if you return. Your confidence is inspiring, Vasquez said. Confidence is not what I sell, Captain. Information is. And right now, the most valuable information in the galaxy is inside that structure. Go get it. The channel closed. On 3 ships, 3 commanders began preparing to walk into a living continent that none of them understood, for reasons none of them fully agreed on, because the only alternative was sitting outside it forever. It was the first time since arriving at Sector Oris 7 that all 3 factions had agreed on anything. It would not be the last, but none of them knew that yet. 1. The Delegations. 3 shuttles launched within the hour. From the Fist of Vorkath, a Drakor assault shuttle carrying Warlord Thorruk and 12 of his best soldiers. Full combat armor, siege rifles, breaching charges. Thorruk carried his own weapon, a warhammer forged from compressed warship hull metal, weighted for a Drakar's strength, heavy enough to crack a bulkhead. He had carried it in every engagement for 40 years. It had never failed to solve a problem. Thorruk had considered bringing more. He had considered bringing a Thrak boarding pod. He had settled on 12 because that was what fit in a shuttle, and because anything less than his entire fleet would make no difference against something this size. From the Luminarch Etherius, a crystal barge carrying high Resonant Syvelith, her attendant Kalindra, 4 Velithari guards in crystal weave armor that shimmered with wardlight, and a scholar named Aelindra. Aelindra was young, barely 80, which for a Velithari was practically adolescent, with deep silver eyes that marked her as a student of the deep current. She had spent 40 years studying the theoretical intersection of the deep current and biological systems. She had published 7 treatises. None of them had prepared her for what she was about to walk into. From the Defiance, a human transport carrying Captain Vasquez, 8 Marines in standard combat kit and 3 crates of equipment, vibration sensors, atmospheric analyzers, recording devices, and a portable spectrograph that Vasquez had requisitioned from the xenoarchaeology team because they weren't using it and he was tired of not understanding things. Aboard the Vault of Whispered Ledgers, Merchant Prince Yaveth watched the 3 shuttles depart and did not send one of its own. The entity was an unknown. Unknowns could not be priced. Things that could not be priced could not be leveraged. And things that could not be leveraged were, by Thyrasil reckoning, dangerous in a way that weapons and wards were not. Yaveth would observe. Yaveth would analyze. Yaveth would wait for the others to take the risk and then sell whatever they learned. That was the Thyrasil way. It had worked for centuries. It was starting to feel inadequate. 2. Entry. The route corridor was wide enough for all 3 shuttles to fly through side by side. It had not been that wide yesterday. It opened for us, Kalindra said from the crystal barge, her golden eyes wide. The corridor expanded as we approached. It knew we were coming. Or it heard our engines and grew toward the noise. Vasquez said over the shared channel. Let's not assign intent where we don't have evidence. Intent is all this thing has, Captain, Syvelith said. Her voice was quiet, strained. The veil burn from weeks of sustained immersion had thinned her voice to something that sounded like wind through crystal. It was grown with a purpose. It traveled across the galaxy with a purpose. It stopped. Growing because it has achieved its purpose. Everything it does is intentional. The shuttle set down in a chamber that had formed at the end of the corridor, a space large enough to hold all 3 vessels with room to spare. The floor was bark. The walls were living wood, amber sap flowing through veins that pulsed with a slow, steady rhythm. The ceiling, if it could be called a ceiling in a structure with no consistent concept of direction, was a lattice of interwoven roots, bioluminescent, casting warm light across the landing space. The air hit them first. Vasquez's Marines unsealed the transport hatch and the atmosphere rolled in, warm, humid, thick with the scent of living things. Not the sterile recycled air of a warship or a station. Real air generated by the leaf structures on the entity's surface, pumped through root corridors and bark chambers by a circulatory system that spanned dozens of miles. It smelled of sap and mineral and something older, something that Aelindra, stepping off the crystal barge behind Syvelith, identified immediately. Deep current residue, she said. Her silver eyes were bright, excited, terrified. The atmosphere itself is saturated with it. Every breath we take in here is infused with the same energy that flows through the deep current. In 40 years of study, I have never been this close to— Breathe, scholar, Syvelith said, and observe. We are guests. The Drakkar assault shuttle opened last. 12 soldiers filed out in formation, 4 ranks of 3, siege rifles up, scanning the chamber with helmet-mounted sensors that returned nothing useful. The entity's deep current saturation scrambled their electronics the way it scrambled everything. Warlord Thorruk stepped out behind them. 8 feet of scarred muscle and cracked bone plating, his broken left tusk catching the amber light. He studied the living walls. His eyes moved to the pulsing sap veins. He felt the bark floor beneath his feet that was, unmistakably, warm. It's alive, he said. Yes, Warlord, his sergeant said. The entire structure is— I know what it is. I'm saying it out loud because I need to hear myself say it. Thorruk turned to the corridor ahead, a passage of living wood that stretched deeper into the entity's core, lit by bioluminescence, curving gently as though following the contour of something vast. We're inside something that's alive. We're standing on its body, breathing its air. A Drakkar soldier near the back of the formation, a young one, barely 30, with fresh ritual scars on his bone plating, muttered something to the soldier beside him. Thorruk's hearing was better than his soldiers gave him credit for. Speak up, Krenak. The young soldier stiffened. I said, it's like being eaten, Warlord, except the thing doing the eating is polite about it. Several Drakkar soldiers suppressed sounds that were not quite laughs. Thorruk looked at Krenak for a long moment. That is exactly what it's like, he said. Stay alert. The Velithari guards had arranged themselves around Syvelith in a diamond formation, their crystal weave armor projecting faint wards that flickered and died almost immediately. The energy saturation was too intense. For sustained arcana use, one of the guards, a tall Velithari with pale blue skin and an expression of controlled discomfort, noticed a Drakkar soldier staring at his flickering armor. Problem, the Velithari guard said. The Drakkar soldier, twice his width, holding a siege rifle that weighed more than the Velithari's entire body, shrugged. Your armor's broken. My armor is adapting to an unprecedented energy environment. Looks broken. The Velithari guard's jaw tightened. The Drakkar soldier's tusks shifted in what might have been a grin. Between them, a human marine watched the exchange with the weary expression of someone who had seen this dynamic play out 100 times and was tired of it. Gentlemen, Vasquez said without looking at any of them, the living continent is waiting. Move. They moved, and as they moved, the structure moved with them. The bark floor shifted under their feet, not dramatically, not enough to unbalance, but enough to feel. Each step produced a faint compression, as though the surface was registering their weight and adjusting. The Drakkar soldiers, heaviest of the three groups, sank slightly deeper with each stride. The Velithari, lightest, barely dented the surface. The humans fell somewhere in between, their boots leaving faint impressions that filled in behind them, as the bark regenerated. "It's tracking us," a Marine whispered to the soldier beside him. "The floor knows where we are." "The floor is alive," the soldier whispered back. "The floor is literally alive. I signed up for combat duty." Vasquez heard both comments and said nothing because they were both correct and neither was useful. The sap veins in the walls brightened as they passed, a slow pulse of amber light that followed the delegations like a spotlight, illuminating the corridor ahead and dimming behind. The entity was watching them, not with eyes, with everything. Every surface, every root, every vein of flowing sap was a sensory organ, and the delegations were walking through the middle of its attention. The temperature rose as they moved deeper. Not uncomfortably, the entity was maintaining conditions that were tolerable for all three species simultaneously, which should have been impossible given the Drakkar's preference for heat, the sea, Velithari's preference for cool, and the human's preference for whatever was available. The compromised temperature was warm, humid, the kind of air that made you want to slow down and breathe deeply, which was perhaps the point. 3. The walk. The entity guided them. There was no other word for it. The corridors did not remain static. They shifted subtly as the delegations moved deeper. A passage that had branched left sealed itself with fresh growth. A dead end opened into a new corridor that hadn't existed moments before. The route spiraled inward, following a path that wound through the entity's structure like a thread through a labyrinth, always trending toward the center. The deeper they went, the more alive the structure felt. Near the surface, the bark had been dense and uniform, construction material, infrastructure. Here, deeper in, the walls had texture, grain patterns that shifted like wood rings seen in cross-section. Sap veins that pulsed in complex rhythms, not the steady heartbeat of the surface, but layered patterns, multiple rhythms overlapping, as though the entity's circulatory system was carrying more than just nutrients. Aelindra stopped walking. She pressed her hand to the wall. Her silver eyes went wide. "It's thinking," she said. "These sap patterns, they're not circulatory. They're cognitive. The sap is carrying information. The walls themselves are processing." She looked at Syvelith. "High resonant, this entire structure is a mind. We are walking through a living brain. A brain the size of a continent," Vasquez said. He was recording everything. The vibration sensors mounted on his Marine's armor were picking up patterns that his equipment translated into waveforms on a portable display. And these vibration readings, and they're getting more complex the deeper we go, more structured, like a signal that's becoming more coherent. Thorruk said nothing. He walked with his arms crossed, his soldiers behind him, and his eyes tracked everything. The shifting corridors, the pulsing walls, the way the bark floor gave slightly under his weight, as though the entity was feeling the pressure of each footstep and adjusting. A Drakkar soldier, Krenak again because Krenak could not stop talking, reached out and touched the wall as they walked. The bark was warm under his fingers. The sap vein nearest his hand pulsed brighter at the contact, then dimmed. He pulled his hand back. "It felt me," he said to the soldier beside him. "I touched it and it noticed." "Stop touching things," Thorruk said without turning around. A Velithari guard glanced at Krenak with an expression that, on a Velithari face, was indistinguishable from contempt. The Drakkar soldier caught the look. "Something to say, Crystal Skin?" "Only that a species which explores by touching everything it sees explains a great deal about Drakkar foreign policy." Krenak's hand moved toward his sidearm. The Velithari guard's wardlight F flickered. Between them, a human Marine sighed audibly and stepped forward, physically inserting himself into the gap. "Not here," the Marine said. "Not inside the giant living thing that can crush all of us." Save it for the bar. Krenak looked at the Marine. The Velithari guard looked at the Marine. The Marine looked at neither of them and kept walking. Further on, the corridors narrowed and then widened in a rhythm that Elindra realized, after several minutes of observation, corresponded to the entity's sap flow cycle. The structure was breathing, not with lungs, with its entire body. The corridors contracted slightly as sap flowed outward toward the leaf structures, then expanded as it returned. Walking through them felt like walking through the throat of something vast and calm. Then Krenak looked at the floor, and then at the ceiling, and then at the walls, and said, very quietly, "Warlord, there is no up." He was right. The gravity had been shifting gradually as they moved deeper. Near the surface, it had been consistent, a pull toward the entity's densest mass. Here, in the deeper corridors, it was distributed differently. The floor was wherever the entity decided the floor should be. Corridors curved in directions that should have felt wrong but didn't, because the mass beneath each surface generated just enough pull to make walking feel natural. They were moving through a structure that had no axis, no orientation, no concept of direction, and it was making them comfortable anyway. That, more than anything, unsettled the Drakkar. A thing that could manipulate gravity was a thing that could be weaponized. A thing that chose to make them comfortable instead was making a statement about power that Thorruk understood perfectly. I could disorient you. I am choosing not to. After what felt like 2 hours of walking, the corridor opened. 4. The chamber. The space was enormous. A cathedral would have been lost in it. The chamber extended in every direction, not a sphere, not a dome, but an organic cavern shaped by growth rather than design, its walls curving and branching, in patterns that followed no geometry any of them recognized. Bioluminescent sap flowed through veins that covered every surface, casting warm amber light that shifted and pulsed in the layered cognitive rhythms that Elindra had identified in the corridors. At the center stood the tree. It was massive, 300 feet from root base to crown, growing from the chamber floor in a trunk thicker than the Drakkar shuttlecraft. Its bark was ancient in a way that made no sense for something that was days old, deep-grained, fossilized in patches, patterned with rings that should have taken millennia to form. Bioluminescent sap coursed through veins across its entire surface, brighter and more complex than anywhere else in the entity. Its branches spread across the ceiling of the chamber, roots extended into the floor, and where the two met, where branch became wall, became root, became floor, the boundary between the tree and the entity itself disappeared. The tree was the entity was the tree. They had always been the same thing. The continent of living matter was just the body. This was the mind. And from the trunk, at approximately the height where a face would be if a tree had a face, a node was growing, dense, dark, a knot of bark and concentrated sap that pulsed with a rhythm different from everything else, slower, more deliberate, as though it was measuring each pulse, calibrating, adjusting, trying to speak. The Delegations stopped at the edge of the chamber. For a long moment, no one moved. "That's the biggest tree I've ever seen," Krenak said, "and I've seen Thyrasil on a sensor display." "You have never seen Thyrasil," Thorruk said. "Be quiet." Syvelith stepped forward. Kalindra moved with her, instinctive, protective. The Velithari guards spread into their diamond formation. Elindra followed, her silver eyes locked on the node, her hands trembling with the effort of not touching everything. "High Resonant," Elindra whispered. "The node is a communication interface. I can feel it. The deep current energy is concentrated there, more focused than anywhere else in the structure. It is trying to create a point of contact, a place where its cognition can translate into something we can perceive." Syvelith closed her white eyes. She reached, not physically, but through the veil stream, pressing deeper than she normally dared, toward the place where the veil stream thinned and the force beneath it bled through. The force responded, not the way the deep current had responded to her before, that had been vast, overwhelming, impersonal. This was different. This was focused, directed. Something was reaching back. Fragments hit her. Not words, not thoughts. Impressions. The sensory language of the Verdanthes translated imperfectly through the veil stream into something a Velithari mind could almost parse. She felt age. She felt grief. She felt questions. Vast, patient questions that had been waiting millennia to be asked. "It is trying to speak," Syvelith said. Her voice was barely audible. "It has memories, old memories, not its own. Given to it. Encoded. It carries the weight of 12,000 years that it did not live through, and it is trying to form those memories into questions that we can understand." "What kind of questions?" Vasquez asked. He had moved closer, his vibration sensors pointed at the node. The waveforms on his display were spiking, complex, structured, almost patterned. "The same ones," Syvelith said. "What is behind the gate? Why the voice said goodbye? Why it now says hello?" "Those are not tactical questions," Thorruk said. "No," Syvelith agreed. "They are not." "Then what use is this?" Syvelith opened her eyes and looked at Thorruk, 8 feet of armored Dracor warrior standing in a chamber of living wood, surrounded by a mind the size of a continent, asking what use a question was. "Warlord," she said, "this entity traveled across the galaxy in weeks when it should have taken centuries. It grew a continent in void space. It generates its own atmosphere, its own gravity, its own cognition, and it stopped growing because it had built everything it needed to ask us 3 questions. I suggest we take the questions seriously." What followed was unlike anything any of them had experienced. The node pulsed. The vibrations intensified, not painfully, but insistently. The sap in the walls brightened. The air itself seemed to thicken, as though the entity was concentrating. Its awareness on this chamber, on this moment, on the small collection of alien minds that had finally entered its body and stood before its core. Syvelith communed. She knelt before the node, her hands pressed to the bark floor, her white eyes closed, and she let the impressions flow through her. It cost her. The veil burn crept deeper with every minute of sustained contact, blurring the edges of her physical perception, pulling her toward the place where the deep current and reality overlapped. But the impressions grew clearer, sharper. The entity was learning from the contact, adapting its communication to something closer to what Syvelith's mind could receive. Elindra knelt beside her, recording everything her senses could detect. The energy fluctuations, the sap rhythm changes, the way the deeper energy bent around the node like light around a lens. She was weeping. She didn't notice. Vasquez's equipment mapped the vibrations into visual patterns, waveforms that his analysts would spend weeks decoding. The spectrograph detected molecular compounds in the sap that had no match in any database. The atmospheric readings showed oxygen, nitrogen, and trace elements that should not exist in combination. Everything about this place was impossible, and Vasquez documented it all with the grim efficiency of a man who had given up being surprised and settled for being thorough. And Thorruk stood in the back of the chamber, arms crossed, and watched. For 2 hours. For what felt like 2 hours, his soldiers maintained their formation. They did not relax. They did not lower their weapons. But they watched too. 12. Drakkar warriors bred for combat, trained for aggression, standing in the heart of a living continent and doing nothing because there was nothing to fight. Then Thorruk's patience ended. He uncrossed his arms. He reached behind his back and pulled the warhammer from its magnetic mount. The weapon was enormous. 4 feet of compressed hull metal on a shaft built for hands that could crush stone. It caught the amber light and did not reflect it. He walked forward, past the Velithari guards, past the kneeling scholars, past Vasquez and his equipment, and he stood before the tree itself. Not the node, the trunk. 300 feet of living wood rising above him. "Enough," he said. Not to anyone in the chamber. To the tree, to the entity. To the mind that was the size of a continent and had been sending fragments for hours without giving any answers. "You want to talk? Talk. Stop sending feelings. Say what you mean." He swung the warhammer into the trunk. The impact was devastating. The hammer struck with the force of a Drakkar warlord's full strength, enough to dent warship armor, enough to crack stone. The sound was enormous, amplified by the chamber, resonating through walls and floor and ceiling. Bark shattered at the point of impact. Sap erupted from the wound, amber and warm, sprang across Thorruk's armor, and the entity responded. Roots erupted from the floor. Not slowly, not with the gradual, patient growth that had characterized everything the entity had done since its arrival. Fast. Faster than Thorruk could react, and Thorruk could react very fast. They wrapped around his striking arm, his right, the one that held the warhammer, and his left leg, and they held. Simultaneously across the chamber, every Drakkar soldier was seized. Roots burst from the bark floor beneath their feet, wrapping around legs, arms, weapons. 12 soldiers in full combat armor locked in place in less than a second. Siege rifles were pinned to chests, legs were anchored to the floor. One soldier, Krenak, had his arm halfway to a grenade, before a root coiled around his wrist and held it motionless. Not tightly, not painfully, but absolutely. The roots were as thick as a Drakkar forearm, layered with bark that hardened as it gripped, and they did not give. Thorruk pulled. The roots held. He pulled harder, 8 feet of Drakkar muscle straining against organic material, and the roots held as though he were pulling against the core of a planet. The Velithari guards had not been touched. The humans had not been touched. Only the Drakkar. Only the ones carrying weapons with the intent to use them. "Stand down," Thorruk said. His voice was controlled. His eyes were not. "Everyone stand down. Do not resist." The roots held them for approximately 10 seconds. Then they released, all of them simultaneously, unwinding smoothly, retracting into the floor, the bark surface sealing over as though they had never emerged. The wound in the trunk sealed itself. The sap stopped flowing. The warhammer lay on the floor where Thorruk had dropped it. The message was clear. Thorruk understood it because it was delivered in the only language he had ever truly respected. Physical force, applied with precision and restraint. "I could hold all of you. I am choosing to let you go. Do not strike me again." Thorruk looked at his arm where the roots had gripped it. No damage, no scratch. His soldiers, 12 Drakkar warriors, each one checking their limbs, their armor. Finding nothing. The restraint had been total across all 13 targets simultaneously. Maximum control. 0 harm. The entity had disabled his entire squad in 1 second and released them without a mark. "Understood," he said to the node. And stepped back. The chamber was silent. Every soldier, every guard, every scholar and captain and high resonant stood still and processed what they had just witnessed. The most aggressive warlord in the Drakkar Dominion, restrained by a tree and told to behave. And the warlord had listened. Krenak, standing in the Drakkar formation, leaned toward the soldier beside him and whispered, "Did that tree just discipline the warlord?" "Shut up, Krenak," 3 Drakkar soldiers said simultaneously. Vasquez caught himself smiling and stopped. This was not funny. A tree had just physically restrained the most dangerous warlord in the Drakkar Dominion. Nothing about that was funny. Except that Thorruk's expression, the particular combination of outrage and grudging respect that only appeared on a Drakkar face when they encountered something they could not intimidate, was objectively a little funny. "The entity is not hostile," Elindra said. She was standing near the node, her silver eyes reflecting the amber light, her instruments forgotten in her hands. That restraint was precise. It used exactly enough force to hold him, and not one fraction more. It didn't hurt him. It corrected him, the way an elder corrects a sapling. "I am not a sapling," Thorruk said. "To this entity, Warlord," Elindra replied quietly, "we are all saplings." After that, the communication changed. The node's pulses shifted, deeper, more structured, as though the entity had learned something from the confrontation. The vibrations resolved into impressions that were clearer than anything Syvelith had received before, not words, but close, meaning pressed into consciousness with increasing precision. The impressions built, layer by layer. The entity was telling them something, not asking now, but sharing. A memory. The sundering, experienced from the perspective of a root in the ground. The galaxy tearing apart above, the silence after. The long, long wait. And now, the signal. The hello. The need to understand what was happening because the entity had been grown to understand, and it could not fulfill its purpose without their help. The delegations stayed. What happened next was difficult to describe afterward, not because it was painful or traumatic, but because the experience did not translate into the language of species that measured time in hours. The entity communicated, and they listened. But listened was too small a word. The entity's impressions were not received through ears or minds alone. They were felt in the bark beneath their feet, in the sap-scented air they breathed, in the subtle shifts of gravity and temperature that the entity used the way other beings use tone of voice. Syvelith translated what she could, speaking aloud, for the benefit of Vasquez and Thorruk, while simultaneously processing layers of meaning that she could not put into words. Elindra supplemented with analysis, identifying patterns in the energy fluctuations that corresponded to specific types of meaning, emotional content, temporal content, spatial content. The entity was not just communicating, it was teaching them how to understand it, adjusting its output in real time based on their responses. Vasquez's vibration sensors captured everything. The waveforms grew more structured with each passing hour, patterns that his equipment translated into visual displays that the human Marines studied with the intensity of soldiers reading a tactical map. They could not understand the meaning, but they could see the complexity increasing. Whatever the entity was saying, it was saying more of it, and saying it better with every exchange. Thorruk stood and watched. His soldiers maintained their Y formation behind him. At some point, it was impossible to say when, the young soldier Krenak sat down. Then another soldier sat. Then a third. The formation dissolved slowly, naturally, the way a fist unclenches when the threat it was raised against turns out to be something else entirely. By the time what felt like a day had passed, the Drakkar soldiers were sitting on the bark floor with their weapons across their laps, watching the node pulse, feeling the vibrations in their bone plating, and saying nothing. The Velithari guards had lowered their wards entirely. There was no point maintaining them. The saturation made sustained arcana use impossible, and the entity had demonstrated that it could restrain a Drakkar warlord with a thought. Wards were irrelevant. The guards stood and watched with the particular expression of warriors who have realized they are not needed and are not sure how to feel about it. The human Marines adapted the fastest, because humans always adapted the fastest. One of them had pulled out a ration bar and was eating it. Another was sketching the node in a pocket notebook. A third had fallen asleep sitting up, her rifle cradled in her arms like a child holding a stuffed animal. What felt like hours became what felt like a day, then another. The vibrations grew sharper. The impressions grew more coherent. Syvelith translated what she could. Vasquez recorded what he could. Thorruk stood and listened and said nothing, because the entity had earned his silence the only way anyone could, by proving it was stronger than him and choosing not to use it. And slowly, incrementally, the entity's communication approached. Something that almost resembled language, not words, but the shape of words. The architecture of meaning, built from alien cognition and ancient memory, reaching across the vast gap between a mind the size of a continent and the small, fragile, temporary minds that had entered it. By the time it felt like the third day, the impressions had resolved into something that all three faction leaders understood, each in their own way. I was sent to read the gate. I cannot read it alone. Then with aching clarity, I carry memories that are not mine. I was given the grief of 12,000 years. I was given questions I did not choose. I was grown for a purpose I did not ask for. But I am here, and the gate is there, and I cannot reach it without understanding what you have already learned. I need what you know. I need what you have seen. I need what you remember. and beneath it all, an impression that was not a question but an offer. You will help me understand, and I will share what I learn. The delegations looked at each other, Drakkar, Velithari, human, and for a moment the suspicion and the politics and the centuries of mistrust faded into something simpler, something that every species, no matter how different, recognized on a fundamental level. Not a request, a statement. The entity had not asked. It had informed them of what would happen next. Epilogue. They emerged to chaos. Every channel was screaming. 300 ships, every frequency active, search and rescue teams already suited up, weapons systems hot. The sector had been in panic for hours. Vasquez's transport cleared. The route corridor first. His comms officer's voice hit him before his eyes adjusted to the starlight. "Captain, where the hell have you been? Do you copy? It's been 3 days. We've been hailing you for 72 hours. No signal, no response, nothing. We were about to breach the structure." Vasquez stared at the console. He looked at his Marines. They looked back. To all of them, it had felt like a few hours. Long hours, intense, but hours, not days. "Say again," Vasquez said. "How long?" 3 days, Captain. 71 hours and 43 minutes since your shuttle entered the structure. We tried every frequency. We sent drones in after you. The drones came back empty. You were just gone." Vasquez looked at his watch. It read 71 hours and 43 minutes since entry. The clock had been counting the entire time. It had been right there on his wrist, and he had never once thought to look at it. On the crystal barge, Kalindra was receiving the same frantic hails from the Ethrias. Syvelith sat in her seat, eyes closed, the veil burned deeper than before. She did not seem surprised. 3 days, Kalindra said. Her golden eyes were wide. "High Resonant, we were inside for 3 days." "Yes," Syvelith said quietly. "We were. How did we not notice?" Syvelith did not answer. She did not have an answer. On the Drakkar shuttle, Thorruk received the report in silence. 3 days. His soldiers were checking their chronometers, comparing readings, talking over each other. In rough, agitated voices, every clock agreed. Every clock had been counting correctly. None of them had noticed. Thorruk looked at the warhammer on the floor of the shuttle. He had picked it up before leaving the chamber. It was the first time in 40 years it had failed. To solve a problem. He looked at his arm where the roots had gripped it. No mark, no scratch. And then Vasquez looked out the viewport. What the hell happened to it? The irregular root ball they had entered was gone. What hung in the void now had form, purpose. The gate-facing side had curved into a vast crescent, a concave arc dozens of miles across, its entire inner surface dense with fractal leaf structures oriented toward the echo gate, drinking deep. Current energy in arrays so thick they glowed with a steady amber light visible from every ship in the sector. Inside the crescent's curve, new growth had erupted. Layered canopies of broad, flat structures unlike anything on the entity's surface before. Biological collectors, energy storage, the organic equivalent of a power grid feeding the entity everything it needed for whatever it was planning to do next. The fleet-facing side, the back, was different. Wild, unfinished. Thick root tendrils trailed into the void in every direction, some of them miles long, drifting slowly like the arms of something vast and patient. They were not growing. They were waiting. "It changed," Vasquez said. "While we were inside, it reshaped itself." "It didn't just change shape," Aelindra said from the crystal barge, her voice thin on the shared channel. "It reorganized. The crescent is oriented directly at the gate. Every leaf structure is pointed at the energy source. The trailing roots on the back are..." She paused. "They're structural, load-bearing, like legs bracing before a push." No, one said what they were all thinking. The entity had made a decision while they were inside it. It had reshaped its entire body around that decision, and none of them had been consulted. The 3 shuttles returned to their respective fleets. Debriefs began immediately. Reports were filed. Recordings were analyzed. The vibration data Vasquez had collected would take weeks to fully process. Elindra's observations would reshape Velithari's understanding of the deep current. Thorruk's report to Overlord Kael'vor was, characteristically, brief. The entity is not hostile. It is not an ally. It is a mind. It has demanded our cooperation. I do not believe we have a choice. And aboard the vault of whispered ledgers, in a small cabin she had been assigned 3 weeks ago, Wren Calloway stood at the viewport and watched something she had no words for. The crescent of living matter hung in the void like a cupped hand, reaching for the gate. The trailing roots drifted behind it, dark against the nebula's glow. The Aelith glass shard in her pocket pulsed, warm, bright, synchronized to the same rhythm the entity was broadcasting, the same rhythm the gate was emitting, the same rhythm that had been pulsing on her console screen on Bastion, weeks and a lifetime ago. She held the shard and watched the crescent and waited for whatever came next. End of episode 4, and thank you for watching.